Napoleon successfully took over most of Europe. Why didn't he invade Britain while he was at it? The Battle of Trafalgar, where the British fleet defeated the bigger French one with totally unexpected tactics, made sure an invasion would be impossible. How did the British pull off a victory? On this episode of Intrigued Mind, we'll be taking a look at one of the most influential naval battles in history. Naval battles were supposed to be fought a certain way in the 19th century. There were well-known rules and strategies that everyone followed. But when Lord Nelson was outnumbered by Napoleon's fleet, he decided to do something completely unexpected. His crazy strategy ended up deciding one of the most pivotal battles in British history. If you're interested in early access to videos and live chats with the creator of Intrigued Mind, consider subscribing to our Patreon. Your support will greatly help us keep the channel producing more intriguing content. In 1805, it looked like the future was French. Napoleon was on a roll and had already taken over much of Europe. The Prussians, Austrians, and the Holy Roman Empire were dissolved. Holland and most of Italy had fallen. Napoleon had his sights on Britain next, and he looked unstoppable on the battlefield. Luckily for Britain, it wasn't going to be easy for Napoleon to face them on the battlefield because the English Channel was in the way. He would have to get there somehow first. He and Spain, who he was allied with, put together a formidable fleet that they thought was capable of wiping away any naval resistance the British would be able to put up. After that, there would be nothing stopping the French from invading Britain. The British knew this was coming and decided that the best defense was a good offense. They took the initiative and engaged the French in a naval battle near Cape Trafalgar off the coast of Spain. The resulting fight would change the course of the Napoleonic Wars and the world forever. France was dominant on the ground, but Great Britain ruled the waves. They had managed to impose several naval blockades against Napoleon and had successfully messed with the flow of supplies to and from French territory. Napoleon had actually wanted to invade Britain earlier, but didn't want to challenge them at sea. The British fleet, under Admiral Lord Horatio Nelson, had actually chased the French fleet and their Admiral Villeneuve all the way to the West Indies and back again. The French had been able to evade them and avoid a battle that they didn't think they would be able to win. When they teamed up with Spain, however, they gained a major advantage: numbers. The French-Spanish combined fleet had 33 ships and was sent to attack Naples to distract the Austrians so they wouldn't attack France directly. The smaller British fleet of 27 ships went after Admiral Villeneuve anyway. Admiral Nelson knew that he would need a cohesive battle plan if he wanted to defeat the bigger French fleet. He wasn't going to win a war of attrition, and he couldn't just hope for opportunities to turn up during the battle. He drilled his captains and crew so that they would be disciplined enough to keep it together while people were shooting at them. This was important, since his plan was going to involve getting shot at a lot. Nelson and his captains decided that their plan would rely upon their gunners, which they considered to be superior to the French ones. They wanted a close quarters battle. The battle plan was vastly different from the standard naval strategy of the time. He was ignoring the naval meta that everyone followed, knowing that he'd have to do something unconventional to beat an opponent that outnumbered him. For the past 150 years, most naval battles were fought between two lines of ships that turned sideways at each other so that they could aim their cannons at them while shielding their vulnerable bow and stern. The bow and stern, or front and back, are the worst place to get hit by a cannon. The two lines of ships would blast each other with cannon fire in these line formations while looking for a weak point in the line where they could try and break through and fire at the bows and sterns of the enemy. This would force the enemy line to fall apart and lose communication. It was pretty similar to how land battles were fought at the time as well. You always started off with two lines firing at each other. Villeneuve's fleet was at the Spanish port of Cadiz, near the Cape of Trafalgar. Nelson, who had been blockading the port, ordered his fleet to fall back towards Portugal so they could just observe the Franco-Spanish fleet from a safe distance. Nelson sent 6 of his ships away to go get supplies, and Villeneuve saw this as his opportunity to strike. They would be at an even bigger numerical disadvantage than before. It was almost Nelson's fatal mistake. But luckily for the British, the ships managed to get back in time. 5 of the 6 managed to get back into formation before the battle started. The 6th ship, HMS Africa, was delayed and couldn't actually get into proper formation, but still took part in the battle. HMS stood for His Majesty's ship. The Franco-Spanish ships were sailing in a straight line facing north, following typical naval strategy. Nelson split his fleet into 2 lines and sailed eastward directly towards them at a 90-degree angle. This was completely unexpected and turned the French's expectations on their heads. Nelson's plan was to just tank the cannon fire and intersect the Franco-Spanish line at 2 points. Then, each British ship that passed through the enemy line would be able to fire all their cannons right at the enemy's aft and stern. He was making an extraordinary gamble and going straight for the kill. He was essentially just going for what every captain ultimately wanted right at the very beginning. Once they went through the whole line, the Franco-Spanish fleet would be cut into 3 sections by the attack. Then, the British fleet could focus on the middle and rear section, and the Franco-Spanish vanguard would be cut off and unable to do anything. They would have to swing around, and by the time they did that, the British would have already dealt with the other two sections by outnumbering them and blasting them apart with their superior gunners. The first line of British ships would be headed by none other than Nelson himself on the flagship HMS Victory. The second line would be led by Vice Admiral Cuthbert Collingwood on board the HMS Royal Sovereign. Nelson flew a signal from the flagship, which read, "England expects every man to do his duty." The entire fleet cheered. According to their plan, Nelson and Collingwood headed directly for the Franco-Spanish line, which was moving slowly because the winds were very weak. The British ships, as anticipated, came under heavy fire and were unable to shoot back because they were facing the line head-on. In Collingwood's line, the HMS Belle Isle was fired at by 4 French ships and took crippling damage. Her mast was destroyed, but she somehow kept the flag flying for 45 minutes until the other ships in the line could come to her aid. In Nelson's line, the HMS Victory also took heavy damage. Many of her crew members were killed by cannon fire. The steering wheel was blown off, and so they had to steer the ship with the tiller below the deck. But they survived the onslaught of cannonballs and cut the French line right between Villeneuve's flagship, the Bucentaure, and the Redoutable. This was where the gamble paid off. Now, the British could hit open targets on both sides of their ships. The HMS Victory fired at the Bucentaure and then the Redoutable. The French were forced to try to board the HMS Victory. They had a strong infantry and attempted to take over the British ship via hand-to-hand combat. The British gunners were called up to the top deck to try and fend off the French boarders, but were scattered by French grenades. It started to look like Nelson's unconventional strategy had been a huge blunder. But just when it seemed like the HMS Victory would not be victorious, the HMS Téméraire pulled up to the starboard bow of the Redoutable and opened fire. The Redoutable was forced to surrender, but the boarding melee still caused a lot of casualties for the British. Admiral Nelson was shot by a musket between the shoulder and the neck. He exclaimed, "They finally got me. I am dead," before being carried below deck to the doctor. He died a few hours later. Since the northern third of the Franco-Spanish fleet was cut off and unable to engage the British, the rest of the fleet was outnumbered and outgunned. Each ship put up resistance, but was ultimately overwhelmed. One by one, the French and Spanish ships had to surrender. The Franco-Spanish ships that were north of Nelson's line realized that the battle was over, and so they sailed away from Trafalgar and off towards Gibraltar. The battle was over fast. The British captured 22 ships and lost none of their own. Nelson's body was preserved in a barrel of brandy on the way back to Britain, and he was given a hero's funeral in London. In the center of the city, Trafalgar Square was named after this battle, and a statue of Nelson was put there. The British Royal Navy was never seriously challenged by the French again, and they were the masters of the seas all the way up until World War II. Despite Nelson's success, his tactics were almost never tried by anyone ever again. He was a once-in-a-generation admiral who pulled off the unthinkable to save his country. For more videos on the most amazing forgotten parts of our history, be sure to subscribe to the Intrigued Mind channel. Like the video and leave your suggestions in the comments below.